The last thing we'll be covering in this module will be validation. Now we are only going to cover the basics of validation in Angular. There's a lot more that can be done than we'll look at here, but this will give us the basic tools that we can use to implement more complex and more full-featured solutions. We'll start by looking at the required attribute in our form fields. We'll discuss how Angular looks at that to determine a form's validity. Then we'll learn about the ng pattern directive, which is the meat of validation using Angular. We'll also look at the properties Angular gives us to tell us about the validity of our form. And finally, we'll look at the different CSS classes that Angular puts on our form fields to tell us about their validity, which we can use to manipulate the display of those fields. So let's start by going over to our new event form. Now what I want to do is make sure that the name is required when a user creates a new event. So I'm going to mark it with the required attribute. Now my browser is going to honor this attribute and not allow me to submit the form. So if I go over to the browser and leave the event name blank and try to click save, I'm going to get an error. What we can't see is behind the scenes, Angular is actually marking that field as invalid and that form is invalid. And that's something we could take advantage of, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Now let's talk about the pattern directive. Over in my event date, I also want this to be required, so I'm going to mark that as required as well. But I also want to make sure that users enter data in the pattern of mmddyyyyy. So I'm going to use the ng pattern directive, and I'm going to fill this in with a regular expression that will validate that pattern. Now before I can utilize this, I've got to do something else. I've got to go in my controller and I've got to wrap my save event and make sure that the form is valid before I do anything with it. Now I can see that I don't have a new event form in scope, so I'm going to go up and add that as a parameter. Then I'll go back to my HTML, and in order to get that as a parameter on the save event method, I've got to do two things. I need to go up to my form and give it a name. And then I got to go down to the method and add that as a parameter. And now that I've got that in place, Angular is going to validate those first two fields for me. Refreshing the page, so I'm going to give name a value. And I'm going to go down to event date and give it a value, but I'm not going to give it the right pattern. Now you can see when I click save, I get no alert. This is because Angular realizes that the form is not valid yet. But if I go in and give it the right pattern, now the save event is passing through that valid check and firing my alert. But if you noticed, there's kind of an issue here. Event date is required, but if I fill it at any value that doesn't match the pattern and try to click save, nothing's happening. I'm not getting any kind of feedback. So let's improve the user experience and let's disable that save button unless the form is valid. So go back to our code and I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to add the ng disabled directive, and in here I'm going to say my new event form is invalid. So that will disable the button as long as the form is invalid. I'll save that. Let's go back to our browser and refresh. So no matter what I do, I can't click on it, and I'm getting visual feedback that I can't do anything. So let's go up and give the name field a value. And let's try putting an invalid pattern in here. And you can see the button has not been enabled. But if I give it a correct value, the instant becomes correct, the save button gets enabled. So that's very helpful. In addition to the invalid property that exists on forms, the form actually tells us a few more things. Let's go into our controller and let's log out that form so we can see some of the other properties that Angular gives us about that form. Alright, looking at the form, there's only a few properties I want to pay close attention to. Dirty, which indicates that the form has actually been changed. Invalid, which indicates that the form is invalid. Pristine, which is the exact opposite of dirty. And valid, which is the exact opposite of valid. These four properties will always contain up-to-date values, and so you can use the one that makes most sense for any expressions that you need. Now let's look at one more thing about validation. Angular conveniently sets CSS classes on our input fields and our forms to indicate what state those fields and forms are in, and then we can use that to adjust the display of our fields and forms. So let's look at the new event field, We can see down here that the classes it has are ngDirty, ngValid, and ngValidRequired. So this indicates that it's dirty because the value's been changed, it's still valid, and it also has the required attribute. But if I come up here and take out the value, all of a sudden it becomes dirty, invalid, and invalid required. Now let's take a little bit of advantage of this knowledge and go back to our code, and let's create a style that will help us see which fields are invalid. So as you can see, any input that is both invalid and dirty is going to have a background color of pink. Going back to our form, let's refresh the page and see everything's got a background color of white. But the moment I put an incorrect value in here, the background color goes pink. And that will be true until I give it a correct value. And then the pink goes away. So using these tools, you can create any kind of form validation you need to do with Angular. Now let's review with a quiz. In form validation, what is the opposite property to dirty? The pristine property has the exact opposite value as dirty. Which directive lets you create a regex for validation? That is the ngPattern directive. And what property does a form require in order to check validity? A form must have a name in order for you to check any of the validation properties.